When people talk about the Bible, they often frame it as a source of timeless wisdom, a moral compass, a guide to living a righteous life. But buried in its pages are laws so bizarre, so outdated, and sometimes so downright laughable that they raise a serious question. How could anyone have ever believed these were divine instructions for humanity? Let's start with food laws. In the book of Leviticus, you're told not to eat shellfish, pork, or animals that don't both chew the cud and have split hooves. Lobsters and shrimp are apparently abominations, yet locusts, crickets, and grasshoppers are perfectly fine to eat. Think about that. The God who supposedly created the vast variety of edible life forms on Earth decided to ban scallops, but gave the thumbs up to grasshoppers. Fast forward to today, and millions of people happily enjoy shrimp cocktails without a trace of guilt. Meanwhile, hardly anyone is lining up at restaurants to order a plate of fried locusts. Then there's the law about mixing fabrics. The Old Testament explicitly forbids wearing clothes made of two different kinds of material, wool and linen together. Sinful. This makes no practical sense whatsoever. Was it about ancient purity rituals? Maybe. But if this was supposed to be a universal law from a perfect creator, why would anyone care what your t-shirt is made of? If you're wearing cotton polyester blend socks right now, congratulations, and you're breaking a holy commandment, but it doesn't stop there. The Bible is filled with laws that govern the most trivial aspects of daily life, while ignoring bigger issues that genuinely matter. Take Deuteronomy's rule that you must not plant two different kinds of seeds in the same vineyard, or the command that fields shouldn't be plowed with both an ox and a donkey together. It sounds more like micromanagement from a nitpicking bureaucrat than guidance from an all-knowing deity. And again, if you look around today, modern agriculture runs just fine without following these strange prohibitions. Some laws are not just laughable, but disturbing. In Deuteronomy, if a woman is not a virgin on her wedding night, she's to be stoned to death at her father's doorstep. That's not quirky or funny. That's barbaric. And it highlights how these so-called divine rules often reinforce control, especially over women. Instead of encouraging equality or compassion, the law sanctioned violence to protect male honor. The punishment system throughout the Bible is equally absurd. In Numbers, a man is executed for gathering firewood on the Sabbath. Think about that. A death sentence for picking up sticks. Meanwhile, laws about owning slaves were perfectly acceptable. The double standard is staggering. Rest on the wrong day, death, but enslaving another human being, allowed as long as you follow the rules. There are also laws that blur the line between religion and superstition. For example, in Leviticus, a menstruating woman is labeled unclean for 7 days, and anyone who touches her becomes unclean too. The same applies to anything she sits on or lies on. It's hard not to see how this would have fueled stigma and isolation for women in those times. Worse yet, those ideas lingered culturally for centuries, feeding taboos and discrimination. Another example is the ritual for testing a woman accused of adultery, described in Numbers. The priest makes her drink a concoction of water mixed with temple dust. If she's guilty, her body will supposedly waste away. If she's innocent, nothing happens. That's not divine justice. That's a primitive lie detector test with magical thinking. And of course, it only ever targeted women, not men. One of the strangest laws comes from Deuteronomy, where if two men are fighting and the wife of one tries to help her husband by grabbing the other man's genitals, her hand must be cut off. No mercy, no exceptions. That's the actual wording. If you read that in any other ancient book, you dismiss it as the bizarre obsession of a long-forgotten culture. But because it's in the Bible, generations of believers called it holy. The Bible also dictates laws about haircuts and beards. Men are forbidden from trimming the edges of their beards. Some groups even take this literally to this day. But think about it. In a world where hygiene, professional appearance, and personal style are normal considerations, why would the shape of someone's beard matter to an all-powerful God? Even farming practices are subject to divine rules. Leviticus commands that fields should not be harvested to their edges, and grapes shouldn't be picked clean from vineyards, leaving some behind for the poor. Now, this one almost sounds charitable at first, but it raises a question. Why did God need to legislate generosity instead of fostering a spirit of kindness and compassion? The law treats charity like another ritualistic checkbox rather than an organic part of human decency. And then there's the obsession with animal sacrifices. The Bible has endless details about how many bulls, rams, or birds should be slaughtered, what part of the animal should be burned, and what should be offered on the altar. At its core, this was just an elaborate barbecue ritual cloaked in sacred language. The idea that a supreme being needed the smell of burning flesh to be pleased is not just laughable. It's deeply unsettling. When you add all this up, the pattern is clear. These laws were not designed with universal morality in mind. They were the product of a small, ancient society trying to regulate behavior, enforce purity, and control people's lives. And while some of these rules might have had practical roots in that time and place, elevating them as eternal laws for all. Humanity is where the absurdity comes in. What's even more telling is how selective modern believers are about these laws. You'll rarely hear sermons about the ban on mixed fabrics or the command to stone disobedient children, but you will hear cherry-picked verses used to justify positions on social or political issues. That selective reading says it all. People instinctively know that much of the Bible's law is outdated or laughable, but they cling to the parts that support their existing beliefs. And here's the deeper point. If a text claims to come from a perfect, all-knowing God, shouldn't every law stand the test of time? Shouldn't they reflect wisdom that transcends culture, era, and circumstance? Instead, what we see in the Bible is the opposite. Rules that reveal the fears, biases, and limitations of the humans who wrote them. The laughable laws of the Bible are more than just quirky relics. They are evidence that the book reflects its human origins. That doesn't mean these laws can't be studied, understood, or even appreciated in a historical context. But they certainly don't belong in modern discussions about morality, justice, or human rights. And maybe that's the real takeaway. When you strip away the claims of divine authority and simply look at these laws for what they are, you realize something simple. People don't need commands about fabrics, beard shapes, or sacrifices to live meaningful, ethical lives. What we need is compassion, reason, and a sense of shared humanity, qualities that have carried us far beyond the limits of ancient rule books. One law that often gets overlooked but really highlights the absurdity is the one about levirate marriage. In Deuteronomy, if a man dies without children, his brothers required to marry the widow and produce offspring in his brother's name. If he refuses, there's a whole ritual where the widow takes off his sandal, spits in his face, and declares that his family will forever be known as the house of the unsandaled. It reads like satire, but it was once treated as serious law. And it shows how women were seen less as independent people and more as extensions of a man's family line. Then there's the rule about rebellious children. In Deuteronomy 21, if a son is stubborn or rebellious, won't obey his parents, or is a drunkard and glutton, the parents are told to bring him before the town elders. Then the men of the city are to stone him to death. That's not just strict parenting. That's a legal execution of a teenager for being difficult. And this is considered holy law. Other laws just sound like they belong in a comedy sketch, like in Leviticus, where it says, anyone who curses their mother or father must be put to death, or the prohibition on touching pigskin, a law that would make every football game in the modern world technically a sin. You start to wonder how seriously these rules were ever enforced, or if they were more about control and intimidation than about actual justice. Some laws show an obsession with ritual purity rather than morality. For example, in Leviticus, after a man has an emission of semen, he is considered unclean until evening and must wash himself. If it happens while he's lying in bed, the whole bed is unclean. If he touches anything, that thing becomes unclean too. In today's world, where we understand biology, hygiene, and human sexuality, these rules look less like divine wisdom and more like superstition wrapped in fear. There's also the law in Exodus about sorceresses. Do not allow a sorceress to live. It's vague, open to abuse, and it fueled centuries of witch hunts and executions. People accused of witchcraft, most of them women, were tortured and killed, all because an ancient book said they should be. That's not just laughable, it's tragic. It shows how dangerous outdated laws can be when people take them literally. Other laws speak to property and ownership, but in ways that sound completely alien to modern value. Exodus 21 says, "If a man sells his daughter as a servant, she is not to go free as male servants do." That's literally a law about selling your child into slavery. And it tells you everything about how little children and women were valued in those societies. And again, these weren't moral laws. They were survival rules for a patriarchal tribal culture. The laws about slaves are especially disturbing. In Leviticus, Hebrew slaves could be released after 6 years, but foreign slaves could be owned permanently, even passed down as property. A divine endorsement of permanent human bondage. And yet, many people still insist this book is the foundation of morality. It's hard to reconcile the idea of eternal wisdom with laws that normalize slavery. And while on the topic of ownership, the Bible is strangely specific about animals. If someone's ox gores another person to death, the ox is to be stoned. But if the ox had a history of goring people and the owner didn't keep it penned in, then both the ox and the owner could be put to death. Unless, of course, a ransom is paid, then the owner's life can be spared. It's like reading an ancient version of insurance law, mixed with arbitrary punishments. One law even regulates toilets. In Deuteronomy 23, the Israelites are commanded to have a designated place outside the camp for relieving themselves, and to carry a stick to dig a hole and cover it up. On the one hand, this almost sounds practical, but when framed as divine law, it looks ridiculous. A God who supposedly created galaxies is giving camping tips about latrines. There's also a recurring theme of mixing fear with obedience. In Exodus 31, working on the Sabbath is punishable by death. That's not just about rest, that's about enforcing control through fear. A community living under that rule wouldn't be motivated by love or compassion, but by terror of execution for something as simple as working on the wrong day. When you read these laws side by side, the absurdity becomes clearer. Don't wear mixed fabrics, don't eat shrimp, don't plant 2 seeds together, but do stone people for gathering firewood or talking back to parents. If this were truly divine, the priorities are shockingly misplaced. And what stands out even more is how modern believers avoid these conversations, and pastors rarely stand in front of congregations and read these laws aloud, let alone tell their members to follow them, because everyone knows deep down they're indefensible in today's world. The moment they're spoken out loud, the supposed authority of the text starts to crumble. But here's the interesting part. These laws also reveal how morality has evolved. Human societies have gradually moved away from these harsh, nonsensical rules, and not because of religion, but in spite of it. Modern ethics is built on empathy, fairness, and the recognition of human dignity, not on whether your clothes are polyester blends or whether you worked on a Saturday. This gap between ancient law and modern morality is important because it shows that our moral compass doesn't come from the Bible. If it did, we'd still be executing rebellious children and banning shellfish. Instead, morality evolves with human understanding, culture, and progress. That's why we no longer see these laughable laws as binding. One of the strangest things about these biblical laws is not just that they exist, but how people treat them. When you talk to someone who takes the Bible seriously, they'll often say, well, those were for a different time, or that part doesn't apply anymore. But that raises a serious question. If a law really came from an all-knowing eternal God, why would it ever expire? Why would the divine need to update his rules like a software patch? That alone suggests these laws were never divine to begin with. They were cultural codes written by human beings, stuck in their own time and place. Psychologically, the way people handle these laws makes sense. Cognitive dissonance is the term for it. When someone encounters information that doesn't fit their belief system, it creates discomfort. So the brain tries to smooth it out. That's why believers ignore some laws completely, downplay others, and hold on to the few that still fit with modern values. It's a selective memory game that lets them preserve faith without confronting the absurdity head on. Sociologically, these laws served an important function in their time. Ancient societies didn't have police forces, public health systems, or scientific knowledge, so laws about food, fabrics, rituals, and punishments were a way to create order. They were less about morality and more about survival and group identity. You followed the rules not because they made sense universally, but because they kept the tribe together. If you broke them, you threatened that unity. And so the punishments were harsh to scare others into compliance. But here's the problem. Once you claim those survival rules are the timeless words of a perfect God, you lock yourself into a contradiction. Modern society has outgrown those rules, yet the text remains frozen in time. The only way to make it work is to cherry pick, embrace what sounds useful, ignore the rest, and hope nobody points out the inconsistency. Take the food laws again. Today, we know that pork needs to be cooked properly to avoid parasites like trichinosis, so maybe the original ban had a practical reason in a world without refrigeration or medicine. But now that we understand food safety, the ban is pointless. Yet instead of admitting it was just a temporary human-made rule, religious tradition insists it was divinely ordained. That insistence reveals the real problem. Loyalty to the text outweighs loyalty to reality. Another example is the obsession with ritual purity. Laws about touching dead bodies, menstruation, or skin diseases weren't about morality, but about fear of contamination. In their world where germs weren't understood, these rituals gave the illusion of control. But when believers today still treat these passages as meaningful, it's like clinging to medieval medical practices in the age of modern science. It doesn't elevate faith. It exposes its limits. The selective enforcement of these laws also shows how much morality is shaped by culture, not scripture. In the American South before the Civil War, slave owners quoted biblical laws about slavery to defend their actions, and in the 20th century, segregationists used biblical laws to justify racial hierarchies. Today, some use biblical laws to argue against same-sex relationships, yet the same people have no problem eating shrimp, wearing mixed fabrics, or working on Saturdays. The pattern is obvious. People reach for the laws that support their existing biases, while quietly discarding the ones that don't. There's also a psychological comfort in having rules. For many, the Bible's laws, even the laughable ones, provide structure. They create the illusion that life is guided by a higher plan. Even if the rules don't make sense, following them gives people a sense of belonging and purpose. That's why even today, groups like the Amish or Orthodox Jews cling to rules about fabrics, haircuts, or food. It's not about logic. It's about identity and control. But for anyone stepping back and looking critically, the cracks are obvious. If morality truly came from these ancient laws, then modern society should look a lot more like ancient Israel. Instead, the opposite has happened. Human. Progress has moved us further and further away from these outdated rules. We abolished slavery, gave women rights, established freedom of belief, developed medicine, and created systems of justice that, while imperfect, don't involve stoning people for gathering wood. That's not because of the Bible's laws, it's because humanity learned to think beyond them. And here's the irony. The very fact that we laugh at these laws today is a sign of progress. What was once taken as sacred is now recognized as absurd. That shift isn't something to fear, it's something to celebrate. It shows that human morality is not fixed in stone tablets. It grows, adapts, and improves as we learn more about the world and ourselves. Think about how these laws would look if we tried to enforce them today. Imagine a legal system where eating a shrimp cocktail or a bacon sandwich could land you in court, where rebellious teenagers could face execution, where wearing a cotton polyester hoodie was a punishable offense. It sounds ridiculous, but that's what a literal application of biblical law would demand. And yet, many believers still call this book the foundation of morality. This highlights an important reality. The Bible's laws are not moral in any universal sense. They are tribal rules bound to a particular time, geography, and worldview. They say more about the fears and priorities of an ancient community than about right and wrong in any eternal sense. When survival depended on rigid conformity, extreme punishments made sense to those communities. But once you put those same rules in a modern context, they collapse under their own weight. And here's the striking part. Even religious communities today quietly admit this. By ignoring most of these laws, they don't execute people for working on the Sabbath. They don't stone disobedient children. They don't ban football for violating the no pigskin rule. And yet, they'll point to the same book when it comes to issues like sexuality or gender roles. The inconsistency isn't subtle, it's glaring. This is where sociology gives us a useful lens. Rules, no matter how strange, serve a purpose. They mark who is in the group and who is out. If you wear the right clothes, eat the right food, and obey the right rituals, you're one of us. If you don't, you're an outsider. That's what many of these biblical laws really accomplished. They weren't about morality. They were about boundary lines. It's about saying, we're different from the people over there. That's why shrimp was banned, but locusts were fine. It wasn't health science. It was identity politics. But here's the problem. When those identity rules are mistaken for eternal morality, they freeze culture in place. They make practices from one small corner of the ancient world into untouchable commandments for all people, across all time. And that's where the laughable turns into the dangerous. Because once you give outdated human rules the label of divine, you close the door to questioning and growth. History shows us how damaging this can be. Biblical laws about slavery didn't just sit on the page, they were used for centuries to justify human bondage. Biblical laws about women's submission weren't just ancient customs, they shaped patriarchal systems that silenced women for generations. Biblical laws about purity fueled witch hunts, taboos, and discrimination. What looks laughable on paper often had devastating consequences when people enforced it as holy. And yet, humans kept moving forward. The Enlightenment challenged the idea that authority must come from sacred texts. Science exposed natural explanations behind what were once thought to be divine commands. Medicine revealed that menstruation isn't unclean and that disease isn't caused by impurity. Philosophy developed frameworks for morality based on empathy and reason, not fear and obedience. Each step pulled us further away from the stranglehold of ancient law. It's worth asking, if the Bible's laws were truly the product of a perfect mind, why do humans keep surpassing them? Why do modern ethics, grounded in human rights and equality, feel more just, compassionate, and humane than anything laid out in Leviticus or Deuteronomy? The very fact that society laughs at these laws now shows that our moral development has outgrown them. But here's the deeper insight. People still cling to the Bible's laws because rules offer certainty. Life is complicated, morality is nuanced, and the gray areas are uncomfortable. Ancient laws gave black and white answers, even if they were cruel or absurd. For many, that certainty is more comforting than the hard work of thinking through complex ethical questions. That's why even today, you'll hear someone quote a verse to shut down a debate. Not because the verse makes sense, but because it provides the illusion of clarity. The reality is that morality doesn't come from these laws. It comes from us, from our ability to reflect, to empathize, to reason, and to learn. That's why we laugh at rules about fabrics and shrimp and why we reject rules about slavery and stoning. Our own moral instincts tell us they're wrong. And if our instincts, experience, and progress tell us more about right and wrong than these so-called divine laws, then it's clear where true morality really comes from. When you step back and look at the big picture, the laws of the Bible form a kind of mirror. They don't reflect divine wisdom, but human limitation. They show us a world where people didn't understand biology, psychology, or justice in the way we do now. They show us a society trying to control behavior through fear, ritual, and rigid conformity, and in that sense, they're valuable. Not as a guide for living today, but as a window into how far we've come. Take the Sabbath laws. Executing someone for gathering sticks is absurd to us now, but it made sense to a community that needed total obedience to survive. Or the dietary restrictions, labeling some foods unclean, wasn't about morality. It was about building a distinct cultural identity. But when you elevate those survival strategies into eternal decrees, you get contradictions that are impossible to defend. So that's why so much energy in religious traditions goes into explaining these laws away. Endless sermons and commentaries try to reinterpret them, soften them, or claim they were fulfilled so they no longer apply. But notice what's happening. It's not that the laws stand strong on their own, it's that they constantly need apologetics to cover up their obvious flaws. A perfect law wouldn't need that kind of rescue work. And here's where the laughable becomes tragic again. Because while we laugh at laws about mixed fabrics or oxen and vineyards, other laws left scars on real human lives. Women silenced or punished under purity codes, children beaten, or worse, under discipline. Justified by Scripture, enslaved people told their bondage was holy because the Bible said so. These weren't just harmless quirks. They were used as weapons of control. This is the danger of taking ancient laws too seriously. They were never meant to transcend time and culture, yet once labeled divine, they became untouchable. The result is generations of people trying to fit modern life into the mold of Iron Age rules, bending, stretching, and reinterpreting endlessly instead of simply admitting the laws were human all along. But here's the hopeful side. The fact that we can laugh at these laws today shows how much we've grown. It shows that morality is not static, that we can recognize when rules no longer make sense, when they cause harm, or when they fail to reflect the dignity of human beings. And by moving past them, we open the door to something better. Instead of obsessing over fabrics, food, or ritual purity, we can focus on principles that actually matter: compassion, fairness, honesty, and respect for one another. Those don't come from stone tablets. They come from our shared human experience, and that's why they continue to evolve and expand as our understanding deepens. So the laughable laws of the Bible leave us with an important lesson. Not that people in the past were foolish, but that they were doing the best they could with the knowledge they had. And the real mistake isn't that these laws existed, it's that people still try to call them perfect, still try to hold them up as a universal moral code long after history has proven otherwise. The more honest approach is to see them for what they are: relics of a bygone age, cultural artifacts that can teach us about the past but should never dictate the present. And once we see that clearly, the laughter turns into something more profound, and the understanding that morality is our responsibility, not something handed down in outdated rule books, but something we must continue to build together. And maybe that's the most freeing thought of all, that our values don't need to be limited by ancient fears or arbitrary commands. They can be guided by empathy, reason, and a commitment to making life better for everyone. Not because a book tells us to, but because we recognize the humanity in each other, and so we arrive at the simple truth. A set of laws that once defined purity, obedience, and identity has become a collection of oddities and contradictions. Some are silly enough to make us laugh, others are dark enough to make us shudder. But together they show us that the Bible's authority rests not on timeless wisdom, but on the fear of questioning. The moment you ask why these rules exist, the cracks appear. Why does eating shrimp matter, but slavery doesn't? Why is trimming your beard a sin, but killing animals for ritual is sacred? Why should disobedient children be stoned while the owners of slaves are protected? These aren't the marks of perfect morality. They are the fingerprints of human culture, frozen in text. And yet, the power of these laws lingers, not because they make sense, but because they're wrapped in the claim of divine authorship. Once you attach God's name to something, it becomes shielded from criticism. People hesitate to laugh at it even when it's absurd. They hesitate to reject it even when it's cruel. And that's how outdated rules survive long past their expiration date. But laughter can be powerful. When we laugh at the law against mixed fabrics, or at the idea of executing someone for working on the wrong day, we strip away the aura of untouchable authority. We see the law not as sacred, but as what it really is, a relic of human fear and superstition. That laughter is the beginning of freedom, the freedom to ask, to doubt, and to move forward. And moving forward is exactly what humanity has done. We've left behind the taboos about food, fabrics, and rituals. We've built societies on ideas of equality, dignity, and human rights. We've developed science to explain disease and biology without blaming impurity or sin. We've written laws meant to protect people, not control them through fear. In every meaningful way, we've surpassed the rules of the Bible. So when we talk about the laughable laws of the Bible, we're not just poking fun at outdated rules. We're recognizing a bigger pattern, that morality is not something frozen in ancient text, but something alive and something that grows with us, something we shape through compassion and reason. And maybe that's the real lesson these strange laws leave behind. They remind us that human beings are capable of outgrowing even the most rigid codes, capable of questioning even the most sacred traditions, capable of building a morality that actually fits the world we live in. That's why, in the end, the laughable laws of the Bible are more than odd historical quirks. They are proof that morality is our responsibility, and that progress comes not from clinging to ancient rules, but from the courage to move beyond them